All right, good afternoon. We'll go ahead and call to order the regular meeting of the City of Murfreesboro Board of Zoning Appeals for March 28, 2012. The first item on our agenda is the consideration of minutes from our regular meeting on February 22, 2012. Those minutes were included with our agenda materials. Are there any corrections to those minutes? If not, those will stand approved as presented. And we'll move on with new business. Our first application there is a variance request. It's application Z12005 by Mr. Dan Wilson of Papa's Butts and Barbecue Hot Sauce Store, requesting the following variances. This is for property located in a commercial highway zone at 2910 Old Fort Parkway. First, a variance from section 26B2C of the Murfreesboro zoning ordinance, which states that when any building or structure is increased by the addition of dwelling units, gross floor area, seating capacity, or any other measure of increased parking intensity, the provisions of section 26, which pertain to minimum off-street parking, queuing, and loading requirements, shall apply to the extent of such increase. And second, a variance from section 26C7B of the Murfreesboro zoning ordinance, which states that parking lots, loading spaces, and maneuvering areas shall be surfaced with asphalt, concrete, or other hard surface dustless material, and be so constructed to provide for adequate drainage and prevent the release of dust into the atmosphere and sediment into the storm drainage system in accordance with applicable codes and standards. All right, I think I've covered that one. Mr. Blomley, if you would review that one for us, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chairman Rogers, and good afternoon, Chairman Rogers and members of the Board of Zoning Appeals. Our first item today, as you mentioned, there is a two-part variance request on property located at 2910 Old Fort Parkway. And we'll bring up the aerial photo now. Subject property is just to the east of the intersection of Old Fort Parkway and Gresham Lane. The property right on that corner, which is directly adjacent to this property, to the west is the MAPCO that's right there at the corner of Old Fort and Gresham. And the property just to the east of the subject property is the Kelton's Pet and Hardware that was built about 3 or 4 years ago. Now I'll kind of zoom in a little bit on the property. Mr. Wilson, the applicant, owns the property and owns the businesses that are on the property. For a number of years, he has had a business called Prestigic Vinyl Creations, which is a fencing supply business. He sells to individuals and to fencing contractors fencing materials. And you can see that he's got a storage lot in the back of his property. The front of the property, which has the building with the office for the Prestigic Vinyl Creations, is there is a fenced-in or an area in front of the fence, in front of the storage yard, which is the area where the public that would go to the business would park. The property was annexed in 1996, but it was developed prior to its annexation to the city limits, and it has had a gravel parking lot for years prior to its annexation in 1996. As you know, gravel is not an approved travel surface for commercial developments per the Murfreesboro zoning ordinance. We require asphalt, concrete, or other hard surface dustless material. But this parking lot is grandfathered in because it was not developed in the city limits and was pre-existing prior to its annexation. In 2011, it came to the attention of the Building and Codes Department that the applicant was actually selling food for consumption on the premises and had begun a restaurant use on the property. And the restaurant use requires a greater number of parking spaces than just the traditional retail office use that had been in there in the past. retail and office requires 1 parking space for every 300 square feet of floor area, and restaurant uses require 1 parking space for every 100 square feet of floor area, or 1 parking space for every 2 seats provided on the premises, whichever is greater. So when the applicant began using the property with a restaurant use, the restaurant use increased the number of parking spaces that he was required to have for the businesses that were located inside the building. Now, if the hot sauce store, which is called Papa's Hot Sauce, if it was purely retail, then it would fall under the 1 to 300 ratio. But with the addition of the restaurant use in there, it requires the greater number of parking spaces. And as Chairman Rogers read earlier, the first variance that he's requesting is a variance from the requirement that when you put a new use or when you add a use onto a property that increases the number of parking spaces that are required, then the increase in parking spaces is required to be brought into compliance with the zoning ordinance. So in other words, what Mr. Wilson would be looking at would be having to pave a portion of his parking lot and leaving the other portion gravel. And so because of the difficulty in determining what portion he should pave, what portion he should leave gravel, because he's not required by our ordinance to pave the entire parking lot, he's made application for a variance. And frankly, staff feels that this is a good candidate for a variance because as we have been analyzing this application with him, we are finding it difficult to give him guidance on not only which parking spaces should be paved, should it be several over here, and then what's in the middle, gravel? Should we require him to pave the driveway aisles, the main entrance aisle coming into the site? The zoning ordinance, the provision of the zoning ordinance that applies doesn't really address a situation like this in which you would have or it doesn't really give guidance on a situation like this where a portion of the property, only a portion of the property would be required to be brought into compliance with that minimum surface requirement of it being asphalt, concrete, or other hard surface dustless material. As I mentioned, the applicant has quite a large lot. If we could pull the aerial up again. This is the area where the public parks, and there is ample graveled area in the back for employee parking and for other parking in order to meet the minimum parking requirements. It's just essentially a matter of whether or not he is required to pave that. And what he is required to pay. In your agenda materials, I provided you with 2 floor plans. The baseline floor plan is what Mr. Wilson had provided to us. This is for his building, and the calculations on the bottom are by staff. With no takeout or dine-in restaurant, the building has 3,568 square feet, which would require 12 spaces. On the second one that has a 5 up in the corner, you'll notice the calculations on the bottom, and the area that's outlined is the area that would be utilized for restaurant space. Here, a total of 26 spaces would be required based upon the amount of space that would continue to be used as office and retail for his fencing business, and the area that would be dedicated to the restaurant. With 26 spaces required for the new uses combined, that is a net increase of 14 spaces. So essentially, what he would have to do is, out of the 26 spaces total that is required for these uses, 14 of those would have to be paved. And as I mentioned, we've had difficulty providing him guidance on exactly how to design a partially paved, partially graveled parking lot and what all he would have to do to come into compliance. As a belts and suspenders approach, we have also added the variance to the section of the zoning ordinance that says that parking lots must consist of the asphalt, concrete, or other hard dustless surface, so that we could cover all of our bases. So we have a variance from the provision that says the extent of such increase of parking must comply with Section 26, and a variance from the requirement that would require those 14 spaces to be paved or other hard dustless surface. Now I'll show you some photographs of the property. That's a photograph of the zoning sign. Here's the front of Mr. Wilson's store as it faces Old Fort Parkway. Here's the entrance, which actually faces east. This is the existing fence, and behind that that separates the main parking area from the supply and storage area to the rear for his fencing business. And this is the gate that leads back to the storage area. Looking along Old Fort Parkway. This kind of gives you a broader view of the parking lot. Directly across the street is a multifamily use. This is a small apartment complex. This is looking down the street on Old Fort Parkway. There are several strip centers along the south side. And this is the Kelton site just to the east. With that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Mr. Wilson is also in attendance. One thing that I would like to mention, though, before we open up the public hearing, is that there are some outstanding codes issues with regards to the property. And one of the reasons why those have not been fully addressed at this time is that Mr. Wilson wanted to have the issue of the parking lot resolved before he knew how to proceed with regards to the inside of the building. And of course, staff's main concern is addressing the life safety issues on the inside of the building, and so once Mr. Wilson has direction from the Board of Zoning Appeals on his variance requests, he will be able to proceed on addressing those codes issues.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Questions for Mr. Blomley? Okay. As it stands, with just a retail office, or just with retail office, he's required to have 12 parking spaces, right?
That's correct.
And he looks like he's got that.
Yes.
How many parking spaces does he have?
Well, it's difficult to tell because of course, none of them are lined off because it's gravel. But he has ample room on site with the area behind the fence for parking for both for all the uses, because he has the parking area up front, and then there's additional room for parking in the back behind the fence, and employees would have the opportunity to park in that area.
Okay, and so I may be missing something. He's required then, if he wants to operate as planned, to have 26 parking spaces?
That's correct.
And you're saying that right now you can't really determine how many he has?
No. We feel certain that he meets the minimum number of parking spaces.
Okay.
What's at issue is whether or not he has to bring the increase, which would be 14 of those 26 spaces, in compliance with the minimum travel surface requirements.
Okay.
And that's really what's at issue. Is it's not the number of parking spaces, it's what surface they have to be.
Okay, so he's got the 26 covered. It's a matter of whether the additional 14 that are required because of the restaurant are going to have to be paved.
That's correct.
You talked about that we're kind of constrained to either granting it as is. Well, let me back up. We're constrained if it's asphalted, that would only asphalt the 14. But can't we, as a part of an application, provide any reasonable conditions as part of our granting of the application, which may include having to pave the entire thing?
Well, I don't know that could be required, because by ordinance it's not. I mean, you do have the ability to place reasonable conditions on the request, but I don't know that that's. I think by ordinance he's just required to pave the 14 out of the 26. So I think that's what he's asking for relief for today, because if he withdrew his request, for example, his variance request, he would still only have to pave 14 out of the 26. And so,
but all the time applicants are coming in here and while they're asking for certain limited relief, we put on other conditions that we think may be applicable, although they haven't asked for them. I mean, I would think that would be something that would be at least a tool in the toolbox. I'm not saying it's something that I would favor. I'm just saying, is that something that we could consider?
I understand what you're saying. But I think that would be essentially, if you required that, you would not be granting the variance, because if you required him to pave the entire lot, that would be completely opposite of what he's requesting.
Yeah. Well, he could have. Okay. Anyway,
Mr. Ives.
No, I agree. Effectively, you would be denying the variance and putting an additional responsibility and expense on him that's not required by the zoning ordinance. So I don't think the board would have the authority to require him to pave the whole. Now
I know all the time, though, we put conditions on that are additional expense or burden that, and we're perfectly within our rights to put conditions on like that.
The kinds of conditions I'm thinking of are limitation on the number of hours people that temporary businesses can be open. Or
dress code violations like this. It's going to be an expense.
Right. And the codes, it's my understanding that he will take steps quickly to address the codes violations if this variance is granted, and I think this variance could well be conditioned on meeting the codes requirements. But while that's an additional expense, that's something he really is going to be required to do in any event. But and we've required people to have trash receptacles and sometimes to have lights. And while that lights might be an expense, but that's a public safety, health and welfare kind of condition that I think would be considered a reasonable condition. To require him to pave more than the zoning ordinance requires, I don't think that would be the kind of condition that we would be able to impose.
The only conditions we can impose address public health, safety, welfare.
Chairman Rogers, if I may interject, it would essentially be denying the application and then placing a condition on the denial, as opposed to typically, because he wouldn't be receiving the relief that he's asking for, and then he would be asked to do more than what is in the ordinance. So, Mr. Ives, and I don't know that we can put conditions on denials.
I don't recall us ever doing that. It'd be very unusual to put a condition on a denial.
Do you know how many parking spaces he has in front of the fence?
I have done some rough estimates, and based on our current size requirements for parking spaces, I believe I've estimated around 18.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Blomley? All right, thank you. Mr. Wilson, anything you'd like to add to your application?
No, sir.
Okay. All right, thank you. At this time, then, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against the application, if you would, please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for further discussions or motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to approve the first variance of the section 26B2. And I don't think there are any conditions.
No, ma'am.
Would one of the conditions, appropriate condition, be addressing the code violations, or is that something he's required to do anyway?
I think he's required to do that anyway. Mr. Ives, would that be appropriate just to get it on the record, or?
I don't think it would be inappropriate to put that as a condition, but I do believe it's required. It'll be required by codes in any event.
As Davis's belts and suspenders approach, right? Okay. All right. Well, we have a motion. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Just to clarify for the record, right as it stands right now, the motion was made without the condition, which I'm fine with. Do we want to add it or leave it alone?
I won't add it because, as he said, it would be coming later.
Okay. All right. Very good. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, Mr. Wilson, you have your application been granted.
Chairman, I believe we should have two motions.
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. That's right. We have to.
While these are closely related, they are slightly different, and I think just for the record, we should have two motions and grant both of them.
Yeah, we have to address the variance from Section 26C7B. We have a motion on that one.
Motion to approve.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Now it's been granted. Thank you.
Come try my barbecue.
This is.
application.
All right. We'll now begin our familiar faces section of the agenda here with application Z 12006 by Ms. Rebecca Talley for the Murfreesboro Noon Exchange Club. They're requesting a special use permit for a group assembly use of greater than 250 persons for property in a commercial highway zone located at the southwest corner of Medical Center Parkway and Robert Rose Drive. Mr. Blomley, if you'd review that one for us, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chairman Rogers. And during our familiar faces section, I'll try to go as quickly as possible, because I know these are annual applications that you see every year. The Exchange Club, Murfreesboro Noon Exchange Club, represented by Ms. Rebecca Talley, is back before the board requesting the special use permit for a group assembly of greater than 250 people. And this is for the Flags of Remembrance Healing Field that they have done for the last several years, I believe the last 3 years, on the piece of property owned by C.M. Gatton, just to the southeast of the Avenue Shopping Center. This year they'll be doing it in the same weekend, Memorial Day weekend. Setup will commence no earlier than May 23rd, and cleanup will conclude by May 30th. On Saturday the 26th at 11, there will be an opening ceremony, and on Monday the 28th at 5, there will be a closing ceremony. In between the ceremonies and during the course of the weekend, the field will be open to the public, and the setup for the event will be basically exactly the same as it has been over the course of the last several years. So I won't go over any of the specifics with you. I'll just bring up the aerial photo real quick. Of course, here's Culver's right here, and the Exchange Club sets up in this field, which is bounded on the north by Medical Center Parkway, on the west by Maple Grove Drive, and on the east by Robert Rose Drive. You'll notice in front of you I have a list of revised conditions. I added some verbiage onto condition number 3 per our sign administrator, and I'll read these conditions, recommended conditions of approval. That all structures brought in, including tents, must meet minimum setback requirements as shown on the site plan. The site must be fully cleaned and cleared no later than May 30th, 2012. And all signage associated with the event must comply with the sign ordinance, including that the subject property is only allowed to have a total of 3 temporary signs facing public rights-of-way, and each such temporary sign can be no greater than 32 square feet in area. A copy of the revised conditions were provided to the applicant before the meeting. With that being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions. Ms. Talley is here if you have any questions for her as well.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley? Ms. Talley, anything you'd like to add to the application? All right. And at this time, we'll conduct a public hearing. Anyone, present wishing to speak for or against the application, if you would, please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for further discussions or motion.
Chairman Rogers, with no discussion, I make a motion subject to staff comments. We approve.
No second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, Ms. Talley, you have that application has been granted. Thank you. All right, we'll next consider application Z12007 by Mr. Alton Sims, requesting a special use permit in order to operate a temporary outdoor vending establishment in a commercial highway zone, and this is for property located at 2510 South Church Street. Mr. Blum, if you'd review that one for us, please.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. This application, as you mentioned, is for 2510 South Church Street, and a little bit later on the agenda we'll be reviewing the same location for Mr. Lloyd's annual fireworks tent. Mr. Sims would like to operate this as he has done in years past. You'll recall last year he deviated a little bit in his application from the way that he had been doing business. He had requested permission to bring a travel trailer, a camper there, so that he could spend the night on his days of business there, which are predominantly Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. The board conditioned approval on that not being the case and approved him to operate as he had done in years past. And so he is not presenting that idea this year. He's not the travel trailer. That is not a part of his application, so I just wanted to assure you that he is proposing to operate as he has done in years past with the 2 10-by-10 pop-up tents that will be broken down at the end of each business day and removed from the property. As I mentioned, the applicant will be operating primarily on Fridays, Saturdays, and on some Sundays, and his proposed hours of operation will be from 8 a.m. until 7 p.m. He has secured permission from the owner of the property as well as the businesses that are on the property to use their restrooms. Even though this lot is gravelled, it's a lot that has been gravelled and used for temporary vending in years past, so it is grandfathered in. One thing that I did want to mention, and this is going to impact the Mr. Lloyd's fireworks application for this site. We can pull up the overhead. When we have reviewed this site in the past, the parcel lines that had been drawn on the city's GIS system were different from what they are shown now. The parcel line actually ran closer to the edge of the mulched area, and we find out that, or in a review of the latest GIS maps, it shows the parcel line actually running through a portion of that gravel area. And you can see that affects that front setback, because you have to be, any structures have to be at least 42 feet from that front property line. And in researching the front property lines, it appears that the way that it's currently drawn on the city's GIS system is pretty accurate. One thing that I will mention, though, is that our city engineering department is looking into the possibility of having that property line surveyed so we know exactly where the public right-of-way begins and ends along that property. But with that being said, staff has informed Mr. Sims about the fact that the property lines show up differently on this year's GIS maps, the parcel maps, and that the tents will have to be placed to meet the 42-foot front setback. And the way that it's drawn on this site plan, it is behind both the 42-foot front setback line along Warrior Drive, as well as the 42-foot front setback line along Church Street. And you'll notice that the fireworks tent that will be before you later on in the agenda is going to request a setback variance for the 42-foot front setback along Warrior Drive. Mr. Sims' tents, however, are small enough to where they can be contained in an area that does not encroach into the required setback. With that being said, if the board approves this application, staff recommends the following conditions. The time period of operation will be from May 4th, 2012 until October 31st, 2012 on the days indicated on the submitted calendar. In addition to the required 42-foot front setback, all tents must meet the minimum required 20-foot rear setback as well. And the tents must be removed from the property at the end of each business day, which is consistent with the condition that was placed on his approval last year. And he is okay with that condition being placed on his approval once again this year. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them, and Mr. Sims is in the audience as well if you have any questions for him.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley? All right. Mr. Sims, anything you'd like to add to your application? All right. Then at this time, we'll conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against the application, if you would, please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for further discussions or motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to approve the application with the necessary conditions set by the staff.
No second.
All right. We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, Mr. Sims, your application has been granted. Thank you. All right, we'll now move on to application Z12008 by Ms. Chrissy Russell, requesting a special use permit in order to operate a temporary outdoor vending establishment, which I believe is shaved ice, in a commercial highway zone for property located at 1911 through 2047 Old Fort Parkway. Mr. Blomley, if you'd review that one for us, please.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. This is basically an identical application to the one that Ms. Russell has submitted, I think back since 2006, with the exception that her time frame is a little bit shorter than it was when she first started operating. And one thing worthy of note is that you'll notice that she is applying for more than 70 days. This is one of the sites that was grandfathered in by the City Council for the maximum 6 months, which was the maximum that temporary vendors could be approved for under the way the ordinance was previously written. She is actually just requesting a little bit longer than 4 months. Her first day of operation would be April 28th, and the business would end August 31st. I think she's found that any time before or after that time period is too cool to do good shaved ice business. With that being said, she has provided her permission letter from the property owner, as well as a letter of permission to use the restrooms at Toys R Us, which is on the adjacent property. And just really quickly, I'll show you the aerial photo. Of course, this is the Toys R Us, the Town Center Shopping Center. And Toys R Us is on a separate parcel from Town Center. This is the Chick-fil-A, and she operates her shaved ice stand right here. If the board approves this application, staff recommends the following conditions. The proposed trailer must pass an electrical safety inspection prior to beginning operation. An electrical permit must be purchased from the Building and Codes Department in order to obtain this inspection. And number 2, the time period of operation will be from April 28th through August 31st. I'll be happy to answer any questions, and Ms. Russell is in attendance as well if you have any questions for her.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley? All right, thank you. Ms. Russell, anything you'd like to add to your application? Okay, then at this time we'll conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against the application, if you would please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for further discussions or motion.
Chairman Rogers, I'll make a motion we approve, subject to staff comments.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Ms. Russell, your application has been granted. Now we'll move on to Mr. Jake Lloyd. Mr. Jake Lloyd has 4 applications, I think. The first one is application Z12009 by Mr. Jake Lloyd for Mid-America Distributors. He's requesting a special use permit in order to operate a fireworks stand at the southeast corner of Southeast Broad Street in Kensington Square Court. Mr. Blomley.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. Apologize for the delay. As you mentioned, the subject property is located at the southeast corner of Southeast Broad Street in Kensington Square Court. See, it's here. It's the gravel portion of this lot, which is located directly to the north of the Dollar General, and it's Kensington Square Court is predominantly an office area with a number of office buildings back there. The gravel area is one of the areas that's been grandfathered in for temporary vending, and Mr. Lloyd has used that lot on an annual basis since 2001, and he's requesting approval for just the July 4th time frame. It appears to meet all of the standards set forth by the zoning ordinance. And if the board approves this application, staff recommends the following conditions, and I'll read the conditions on this one, and then all the other conditions that are identical on the following applications, I won't go through those again. But number 1, certification should be submitted that the tent is flame resistant or treated to be flame resistant. Fire extinguisher should be kept on site at all times. The city's fireworks ordinance should be posted on site. No fireworks are to be set off on site. All signage is to comply with the city's sign ordinance. The site must pass an electrical safety inspection prior to opening for business, and an electrical permit must be purchased from the Building and Codes Department in order to obtain this inspection. The tent must meet all minimum building setback requirements for the CH zoning district, and a tent permit must be obtained for the tent. All grass and weeds growing up through the existing gravel must be removed and or killed, and as no grass surfaces are allowed for the placement of the tent or for vehicular travel or parking. In addition, the applicant may need to add gravel and or smooth out the existing gravel surface, subject to the approval of the planning staff. And finally, no vehicular access will be allowed to Southeast Broad Street. If you have any questions about this application, I'll be happy to answer them. Mr. Lloyd is in attendance if you have any questions for him.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Questions for Mr. Blomley? All right, Mr. Lloyd, anything you'd like to add to this application? Can we make Dollar General pick their trash up?
Mr. Whitaker, the codes director, is here, and I'm sure Mr. Whitaker is making a note and can pass that along to the appropriate staff.
All right, sounds like we're on it. Anything else? Okay. All right, then at this time we'll conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against the application, if you would please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for further discussions or a motion.
Chairman, I'll make a motion to approve the application subject to staff comments.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, that application has been approved. We'll move on to application Z12010 by Mr. Jake Lloyd for Mid-America Distributors. Again, requesting a special use permit in order to operate a fireworks stand at the southeast corner of South Rutherford Boulevard and East Main Street. Mr. Blomley.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. This is another site that's been approved for a number of years. It's located, as you mentioned, at the southeast corner of Main and Rutherford. This site has been approved every summer since 2005 for a seasonal fireworks tent. Mr. Lloyd is making application only for the July 4th selling season for this site. The site, as has been the case in the past, appears to meet all of the standards, and if the board approves this application, staff recommends the 8 conditions that I read before, along with the condition that no vehicular access will be allowed to South Rutherford Boulevard. And Mr. Lloyd, as you know, is here.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Blomley. Questions for Mr. Blomley? All right. Mr. Lloyd, anything problems with this? No. All right. Then at this time, we'll conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against the application? And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for further discussions or motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to approve the application with the necessary conditions that's been set by the staff.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right. That application has been approved. We'll now move on to the third application for Mr. Lloyd. It's application Z12011 by Mr. Jake Lloyd for Mid-America Distributors, requesting special use permit in order to operate a fireworks stand at the northeast corner of Memorial Boulevard and Airport Road. Mr. Blomley.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. This is another location that should look familiar. Mr. Lloyd has been approved for a seasonal fireworks retailer at this location ever since 1997. It's the northeast corner of Memorial and Airport. It's another gravel lot that has been grandfathered in. And he is actually seeking permission on this lot, as he does each year, to operate the seasonal fireworks tent for both the July 4th selling season and the New Year's selling season. I believe last year it was the only tent in Murfreesboro that was open on New Year's. One of the things that, and I'll just kind of briefly let you know, we had a Christmas tree vendor on this lot last year that was open for longer than many of the Christmas tree vendors stay open. And I was a little bit worried about how the Christmas tree vendor was going to the interplay between the two vendors, making sure that one was gone by the time that Mr. Lloyd had to set up. But it really went seamlessly, and the two were able to coexist. Well, they weren't there at the same time, but they were able to share several of the, they used the same tent, and so the tent didn't have to be broken down. They used the same lights on the inside of the tent. So it really went well. And with that being said, any approval of this, staff would recommend that it be conditioned on the 8 conditions that we've read previously.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Blomley. Questions for Mr. Blomley? All right. Mr. Lloyd, anything on this one?
Nothing talking about people throwing trash out of cars.
People throwing trash out of cars. That's Mr. Stockard probably driving by and throwing his trash out. And I'm not sure there's a lot we can do about that one, but All right, well, this time we'll conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against the application? And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for further discussions or motion.
I'll make a motion we approve, subject to staff comments.
I'll second.
All right, motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, that application has been approved, and we have one more for you, Mr. Lloyd. It's application Z12012, making the following request for property located at 2510 South Church Street. First, a special use permit in order to operate a temporary outdoor vending establishment fireworks stand. Second, a variance from Section 25E25 of the Murfreesboro zoning ordinance, which states that in commercial and industrial districts, temporary and accessory structures and uses, except fences, walls, and hedges, shall comply with the same front, side, and rear setback as required for the principal structure. And then finally, a 42-foot variance from the minimum required 42-foot front setback for a temporary structure, which would be the fireworks tent, in this commercial highway zone. And this variance pertains to the 42-foot front setback adjacent to the Warrior Drive right-of-way, I think that you pointed out earlier, Mr. Blomley.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chairman Rogers. This application is, with regards to the special use permit, is essentially identical to Mr. Lloyd's applications for this site in years past, with several exceptions. And Mr. Lloyd has been approved on this site, or his company has, for a seasonal fireworks tent, first from 1996 through 2002, and then from 2005 through 2011. Mr. Sims, who was approved for this site earlier in the meeting, will not be setting up on the site. As you noticed on his calendar, the period during which Mr. Lloyd has to set up his fireworks operation, operate, and then break down the tent, Mr. Sims would not be on the property. So they won't be there at the same time, which has been the case for the past 3 years. As I mentioned earlier, when reviewing the property lines for this site and noticing that on the parcel maps on the GIS system, it appeared that the property line was different than the property lines that we had known to be the case. And after researching the location of the property lines, I determined, and I'm not a surveyor, but I made the best determination that I could with the information that I had at hand, that the property lines shown on the current GIS maps were accurate. And as I mentioned, the city's engineering staff may at some point in the future go back and hire a surveyor to actually physically locate that property line so that we know exactly where the right-of-way ends and where it begins. But with that being said, Mr. Lloyd would essentially like to set up his tent in the same location where it has been over the past several years. He's asking for the setback variance, essentially to be able to keep it in the same location when the property line, if we could pull up the aerial photograph, as I mentioned before, the property line, which you'll see is in a light yellow color, previously went just along the south side of that landscape bed that the city installed. Now the property line is shown to go through that gravel area. Mr. Lloyd would like to set up his tent here, which will be a 30 by 60 tent. And I've met with Mr. Lloyd on the site. It appears that this corner of the tent will actually be roughly 5 feet off of that property line, off the property line, this diagonal property line adjacent to Warrior Drive. But because of the angle of that property line, the tent will actually not be closer to Warrior Drive, to the travel lanes, than the existing apartment building just to the west. It will actually be even with about the ridge of that existing apartment building. But because of the sharp angle of that property line, the north side of that tent would cut into that front setback. So Mr. Lloyd has asked for a setback variance for the tent, and we've gone ahead and advertised it as a 42-foot front setback variance, so that he can locate it. We don't know exactly what the distance would be from the property line, but we know that it would be somewhere around 5 feet, plus or minus. One of the variances is to the requirement that temporary and accessory structures in commercial and industrial zoning districts must meet that same 42-foot front setback that is required of the principal structure. So there's a variance to the requirement that's in Section 25 of our zoning ordinance that says that temporary structures and accessory structures, the same front setback should be applied to them. And then there's a variance from the actual 42-foot front setback in the commercial highway zoning district. Another thing that we identified when reviewing this site, one of the things that we're trying to do a better job of is identify any potential conflicts with utilities, because these tents use stakes in the ground. They drive stakes into the ground several feet. And so we want to make sure we're vigilant of the public infrastructure that's underground and make sure there's no conflict there. We noticed on looking at our GIS system that, if we could bring the aerial back up again, that there is actually a Murfreesboro Water and Sewer Department water line, which I think is one that they purchased from CUD at some point down the road, that is actually on the private property. There's no easement, there's no actual recorded easement to our knowledge, but it would go right where that tent, or right near where that corner of that tent is proposed to go. So when I brought this to Mr. Lloyd's attention, and that typically the tent stakes are not going to be driven as far into the ground as those water lines. The water lines are usually about, according to the Water and Sewer Department, about 3.5 feet buried underground, and the tent stakes at most would be 2.5 to 3 feet into the ground. But we don't want to take any chances, especially when it comes to public infrastructure. So what Mr. Lloyd has volunteered to do is, as a condition of approval, anywhere within 10 feet of where that water line is marked, he will call, and as a condition of approval, this is what I'm recommending as well, is that he call Tennessee One Call, have that water line marked on site, and that anywhere within 10 feet of that water line, that there not be any stakes, that the tent be weighted down with some above ground appurtenance. And Mr. Lloyd says that could possibly be cinder blocks above ground. And he says that there are other means other than stakes to weight the tent down, it seemed to be a good solution that he came up with, to use something above ground in order to protect that public infrastructure. So if the board approves this request, the standard 8 conditions that I've read over before, and then prior to erecting the tent, the applicant must have the water line that is located on the subject property field located, and no tent stakes will be allowed within 10 feet of the marked water line. And number 10, no vehicular access to Warrior Drive will be permitted. I know that was a mouthful, so if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Okay. And Mr. Lloyd is here as well.
Thank you, Mr. Blomley. Questions for Mr. Blomley? Got a question for Mr. Blomley. If there's no easement for that water line, isn't that the liquor store's water line?
Well, according to the Water and Sewer Department, it's a public water line, and it's.
But if I went and buried something on somebody else's property, that would be, be theirs.
I think it was one they had purchased from CUD a number of years ago, I would assume, when they took over service in that area. I'm not sure.
I'm not familiar with this property or this at all, but if it's a water and sewer water line, we would take the position that there is actually an easement, but if it's not a written recorded easement, then we extent of it, the width, and things of that nature might have to be determined later. But the fact that it's there, there is an easement, and it's been over a year, much over a year, so there's no opportunity for inverse condemnation. I suppose a landowner could bring an action to try to force the city to move that line. I'm not sure what that would result in, but I think, again, it'd be our position that there, in fact, is an easement, just not written and described.
Okay. Any other questions? If not, then, Mr. Lloyd, anything you want to add to this application?
Appreciate that. You do a lot more than I do.
All right, then at this time we'll conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against the application, if you would please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed. And we've got 3 components here that we guess we need to address. We'll just take those in order. Addressing first is the request for the special use permit in order to operate a temporary outdoor vending establishment.
Chairman Rogers, I didn't specify this in my staff comments, but the recommended conditions would be tied to the special use permit.
Very good.
I'll make a motion we approve the special use permit, subject to the conditions.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, next we'll consider the request for variance from Section 25E5.
I'll make a motion to approve the Section 25E5 with the necessary conditions set by the staff.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, and then finally, the request for the 42-foot variance of the minimum required 42-foot front setback. Matthew, is it this tent's in the same position it has been in past years?
Yes. In looking at the previous site plans, it was shifted a little bit in the field from what was shown in previous years, but essentially when Mr. Lloyd and I went out there and met on site, he showed me where he had painted into the ground the location where it was last year, and it's essentially going to be in the same location that it was last year and in previous years.
Okay. And since the city did the improvements there to the corner, there's been no problem with traffic cutting across that corner anymore?
I think still, and Mr. Young may
There's
have
a large 3-foot high, maybe 6 feet wide, concrete barrier that has now prevented traffic. There was a little, you can see still some tracks where they're dancing around the improvements they made, but I think it's been fixed now.
People had found a way to still drive on there despite the berm and the landscaping, but Mr. Young is right. In an attempt to fix that problem, the streets department did put some large boulders out there, which I think would wreak some major havoc on the underside of a car.
Not the Impala, though, right?
The Malibu.
The Malibu.
I wish I had an Impala.
All right.
With that, Chairman Rogers, I make a motion we approve, subject to staff comments.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Mr. Lloyd, that application has been granted as well. Thank you. Good to see you. All right, and finally, we'll consider a special use permit amendment request. This is application Z12013 by Ms. Misty Allen for Global Empowerment Tabernacle. She's requesting an amendment to a previously approved special use permit allowing an institutional group assembly use, a church, in a residential single-family RS-15 zone. And this is for property located at 3045 Memorial Boulevard. The applicant wishes to amend the previous special use permits in order to allow child care as a permitted accessory use to the church. All right, Mr. Blum, if you'd review that for us, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chairman Rogers. The property, as you mentioned, is located at 3045 Memorial Boulevard, which is along the west side of Memorial Boulevard, just south of Regal Drive. The property is currently developed with a church use. It was originally approved back in the late 80s, and that was for the front building, and I'll show you on the overhead. This was the initial phase of construction. The church that's located on there now, there are actually two churches there now, but the one that you might be familiar with, because their sign is out there, is the Carpenter's House. And then back in the mid-90s, they received a special use permit to construct this addition in the rear of the site. Just to kind of give you a little bit of background, the Carpenter's House will only be there for a short period of time. They are currently occupying the front of the property, the front building, the original building, and Global Empowerment Tabernacle began occupying the rear portion of the property several months ago. Global Empowerment Tabernacle will soon have a lease for the entire property, and will, after the Carpenter's House vacates the property in the next few months, then Global Empowerment will begin to operate or will begin to use the entire property. When I was first contacted by a representative of Global Empowerment Tabernacle, I told them that what I would have to do is to look up the previously approved special use permits to see if child care was ever approved as an accessory use to the church. And we classify institutional group assembly, or a church, as an institutional group assembly use, and uses such as accessory uses such as daycares are required to be spelled out in the application to the Board of Zoning Appeals, because it's a use that can be a little bit above and beyond typical church operations and can add a little bit more activity so we require that it be spelled out in the application. Look back in the 1988 file when the previous church was originally approved, and then I looked in the 1996 file when the addition was approved by the Board of Zoning Appeals, and the previous church never mentioned child care as a permitted accessory use. So I advised the applicant that she would have to appear before the Board of Zoning Appeals in order to amend the previously approved special use permit to allow child care as a permitted accessory use on the property. One of the things that you'll notice in my staff comments, the property ownership has been going through a transition. The property is now owned by Victory Christian Center, I believe. They recently purchased the property purchased the property at auction, and Swanson Realty and Development manages the property for Victory Christian Center. And so Global Empowerment Tabernacle, in order to make this application, although they had been occupying the building, they didn't have an official lease until Victory Christian Center purchased the property a few weeks ago at auction. And so just today they have secured the lease, and I have that in our files so that they do have a contractual interest in the property, which gives them standing to apply to the Board of Zoning Appeals for this special use permit amendment. It's my understanding that in the near future they do intend to purchase the property, so that in the future they will not just be leasing the property, but they will own the property as well. If I could pull up the aerial photo again. The area in which they want to conduct the daycare center would be a 5,000 square foot space that is at the front portion of the rear building. It's a one-story area that sits a little bit lower than the remainder of that rear building. And you'll notice in the northwest corner of the property, there is a fenced-in area. And I'll show you street-level photographs of or ground-level photographs of the property in just a few minutes. But that northwest corner that fenced-in area is where they would like to have their playground for the daycare. No additional parking improvements are required. There is an abundance of parking on site, paved stripe parking that was constructed when the original church was built and when the addition was built. But you will notice that to the north there are some single-family residential uses. This is Regal Drive here, and the property to the north is zoned RS15. This vacant lot on the corner of Regal and Memorial is zoned CH, but the developed single-family lots just to the north of the church are zoned RS15. Here's the site plan that was provided. Here's the rear fenced-in playground area, and I've hatched off the 5,000 square foot area which would be dedicated to the daycare. The fenced-in playground area, there is a chain link fence around the sides and around the east and west side and the south side. Along the north side, there is a wooden privacy fence, and there are also a tree row that appears to be along the property line. It may be on the church's side, it may be on the neighbor's side, but what the church is proposing is to use the existing tree row and that existing wooden privacy fence as screening for the playground to the neighbors to the north. There will be no lighting added to the playground. It would be daytime use only, and so no additional lighting is required. So staff did not require the applicant to have a photometric lighting plan done. Now, one of the things that I want to stress is that the church must be the operator of the daycare. When the applicant before she filed the application, it was for a day. We had discussed this. It was for a daycare that was going to be a separate entity from the church. And because the property is zoned RS15, in order for there to be a daycare in this facility, it has to be accessory to the church. In other words, it has to be operated by the church and be a church-run daycare. Otherwise, if it's a totally separate entity, then a daycare center would not be permitted in the RS15 zoning district. So staff relayed this to the applicant, Ms. Allen, and Ms. Allen consulted with the church, and a letter was provided by Bishop McCrary, who is the senior pastor there. And in it he states that Global Empowerment Tabernacle will be the proprietor of Kingdom Academy Center and shall uphold all of the functioning and direction of the academy. So, with that being said, that would make it compliant with the requirement that it be accessory to the church, or accessory to the church use on the property. And so you'll find that letter in your agenda materials. A little bit about the daycare itself. It would consist of, it would have child care for children ages 6 weeks to 5 years with a maximum of 100 children, and it would be conducted out of the 5,000 square foot portion of the back building, which I referenced earlier. The proposed days and hours of operation would be Monday through Saturday, 6:30 a.m. until 9:30 p.m. And there will also be several rooms devoted to after-school care for middle schoolers and high schoolers as well. With that being said, if the board approves this application, staff recommends the following conditions. Prior to the issuance of the certificate of occupancy for the daycare space, the applicant must provide a copy of the state license showing Global Empowerment Tabernacle as the license holder. and that's just to ensure that the daycare is, in fact, accessory to the church. The privacy fence along the north side of the proposed playground area must remain in place. If it is ever replaced, it must be replaced with a privacy fence of the same height. The board may wish to discuss whether or not the existing privacy fence and the tree row will be adequate screening, and I'll show you some photographs in a moment. This is the front of the existing church, the front building, which is currently occupied by the carpenter's house, but will be, within a matter of months, part of the facility of Global Empowerment Tabernacle. This is looking back at the front of the space, and this is the area that would be utilized for the daycare. It's a one-story area kind of in the center of the property. And this is just moving back along the property. There again is the area that would be used for the daycare. And this is the back building that is currently being used by Global Empowerment Tabernacle for their offices and sanctuary. This is the house that is on the parcel directly to the south. It was approved as the parsonage, and according to conversations that I've had with one of the ministers there, it will continue to be utilized as the parsonage for the pastor. This green chain link fence is the southern border of the proposed playground area. And this shows you the playground area, and there's the wooden privacy fence and the tree row adjacent to the neighbors to the north on Regal Drive. And you can see that privacy fence stops at the edge of the playground, and it's just the tree row moving forward to the east. Once again, there's the edge of the privacy fence. This is just trying to get you a good look at that tree row. And a wider view of the playground area.
Now that far tree line there, that's part that may or may not be on.
Correct.
the constraint.
Correct.
If we're counting that as part of the buffer and it's not theirs and it gets removed, then I guess then you lose your buffer then.
Right. If it's on someone else's property and they choose to remove the trees, that would be up to them. But whether or not it's on the church's property or whether it's on the neighbor's property, I think without a tree survey, it would be difficult to tell.
Is it Regency Park on the west side there of the church property?
On the west side of the church property is actually it's a large lot, and I'll just show you the front page of that application. This parcel here is the church parcel. That's the parsonage, and there's a large parcel with a house on it, and it looks like a contracting business. If you know where the traffic signal is with Osborne Lane, if you're driving north on Memorial Boulevard, you would turn right at Osborne Lane. If you turned left, you would go down that person's driveway right there. And I think the name of this subdivision directly to the north of the subject property is Regency Estates.
Okay.
But to the west is just a large tract, and I believe one single-family home and as I mentioned, a contracting business.
You know, everything to the north of the subject site fronting Memorial is zoned commercial highway, right? It just stops right there at their lot.
That's correct.
Okay. Okay.
Didn't we have another daycare at one point? It might have been one on Case Lane, I'm remembering, where the fence surrounding the playground, they wanted chain link versus a privacy fence. I don't remember if that was personal preference or some sort of regulation as far as visibility inside and outside and that sort of thing.
I think that that came before us back in 2008. I don't remember what was required back in 2008. They came back before us late last year because they were going to, instead of having the daycare in the sanctuary, they were moving it into the main office. We just required that they had vinyl-coated chain-link fence, and they already had a row of evergreen trees along that property line, and it didn't seem necessary because we knew those trees were on their property. It didn't seem necessary to require anything else.
Okay. Is the wood privacy fence that backs up to Regency Estates, is that the church's privacy fence?
Yes.
Okay. And you mentioned that, okay, some obligation on their part to maintain that privacy fence?
Yes. Yes. We, because it appears to have some age on it, one of the things that we would recommend in our conditions of approval would be that if they ever do have to replace it, that they replace it with a like privacy fence. And and that condition is just in there to make sure that if it ever has to be replaced, that it is not replaced with chain link.
What was the purpose of that fenced-in area when it was the carpenter's house?
I don't know for certain. I would imagine some kind of play area, maybe just perhaps for the Sunday school classes, or but I'm not certain.
Okay. All right. Any other questions for Mr. Blomley?
I have a general question. Does a special use permit stay in perpetuity even though the ownership changes?
Yes.
Okay.
Special use permits run with the land.
All right.
Unless the special use permit is conditioned upon lapsing when the property changes hands.
Okay.
But didn't you say this has to be accessory to the church? Doesn't it have to operate as a church, though?
That's correct. I think what Mr. Halliburton is asking is, since the property has changed hands, or since there's a new church in there, does the special use permit continue to be good, even though it's not the same church that was in there when the special use permit was approved? And the answer to that would be yes, that the special use permit is good indefinitely with the land, as long as whoever the new occupant is using it consistently with the past approvals.
But some big national daycare operation can't come in, buy the church, and then operate solely as a daycare.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay.
So that, and that's the reason why they're before us today, is because in the past, the previous church had never specified a daycare or child care facilities as a permitted accessory use.
Matthew, I know you said the height of this chain link fence, but I don't remember what it was. What was the height of it?
Of the chain link or of the wooden privacy fence?
No, the chain link.
Probably 4 feet. Is that? Do either of you know the height of the fence by any chance? It's approximately 4 feet, and I believe the wood privacy fence is a standard 6-foot privacy fence.
All right. Any other questions for Mr. Blomley?
And if you do have any questions, Ms. Allen, the applicant, is here, as is Bishop McCrary, who's the pastor of Global Empowerment.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Blomley. Ms. Allen, anything you would like to add, or anything you'd like to add to your application? No? Okay. Then at this time, we'll conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against the application, if you would please come forward. And seeing none, we'll declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for further discussion. Or if the board's ready for a motion, we have 3 we need to make. Again, probably, excuse me, I'm looking at the last one. Long day. We have one.
You have to drink for lunch. What do you have for lunch?
I know,
Drink.
Pineapple City.
Yes, it's a pineapple again. All right, so we just have one motion we need to make.
If there's no other discussion, I make a motion that we approve, subject to staff comments.
And I'll second.
All right, I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, Ms. Allen, that application has been approved. Thank you. All right, my favorite part of the agenda, staff reports and other business.
I have none, Chairman Rogers.
Unless there's any other business, we're adjourned.